Russia's hidden crisis, when Putin's own supporters start turning. Something unusual is happening inside Russia. It isn't a battlefield breakthrough. It isn't a dramatic speech from the opposition. And it isn't a new Western sanctions package. It is something potentially more dangerous for Vladimir Putin. People who supported the war are beginning to question the system that is running it. Look at what is happening on the streets. Long lines are forming outside petrol stations. In some places, drivers are waiting for hours just to buy fuel. A Russian resident summed up the frustration bluntly. "We've been standing here for about 40 minutes. For years, the Kremlin has presented the war as something happening far away. Ukraine was supposed to be the battlefield. Russia's cities were supposed to remain secure. The economy was supposed to withstand the pressure. And ordinary Russians were supposed to continue living normal lives. But that separation is becoming harder to maintain. The war is now appearing in petrol queues, supermarket prices, damaged warehouses, disrupted agriculture and even attacks inside major Russian cities. And as those consequences accumulate, something else is changing. The criticism is increasingly coming from people who once defended Putin's war. That is where this story becomes much more interesting. The loyalists are getting angry. Consider the case of the pro-war blogger Gleman. He has spent years supporting the Russian military. He has raised money for soldiers. He has helped collect supplies for troops. He is hardly the profile of a traditional anti-Kremlin activist. Yet his recent message sounded dramatically different. He accused television propagandists of presenting an imaginary victory while the reality inside Russia was deteriorating. Businesses were struggling. Prices were rising. People were becoming exhausted. And the economic consequences of the war were becoming impossible to hide. That distinction matters. Because this isn't necessarily a movement demanding peace. Some of these people still want Russia to fight harder. Their complaint is different. They believe the government is incompetent. They believe officials are lying. And they believe the country is paying an enormous price without receiving the victory they were promised. That creates a particularly dangerous kind of political frustration. A disappointed opponent can be expected. A disappointed loyalist is much harder for a regime to manage. And Gleman is not alone. When the war comes home, the biggest change may be geographic. For years, Russians in Moscow could largely experience the war through television screens. Now the war is increasingly visible outside those screens. According to conflict monitoring data cited in the script, Moscow experienced hundreds of drone-related incidents during the first 7 months of 2026. St. Petersburg has also faced attacks. Events have been cancelled because of security concerns. And locations that were once treated as virtually untouchable are no longer guaranteed to remain untouched. But perhaps the most politically important targets aren't military bases. They are places ordinary Russians know. Take Wildberries, one of Russia's biggest online retail platforms. A number of its warehouses have reportedly been hit, with losses running into the billions of dollars. The significance goes beyond the destroyed merchandise. These warehouses represent something the Kremlin desperately wants to preserve. The appearance of normal life. You can tell Russians that the war is distant. But when the delivery network they use every day is disrupted, the psychological distance becomes smaller. The same thing is happening with the country's military establishment. Even the generals are no longer untouchable. In early August, a bomb reportedly exploded inside a gift package at a celebration connected to a senior Russian aerospace commander. The general survived. But the incident was another reminder that senior officials themselves are increasingly exposed. Russian military authorities have reportedly warned officers to change routines, alter travel routes and take additional security precautions. Yet the reaction among some pro-war supporters wasn't focused only on the attack. They were furious about something else. The reported cost of the dinner. Around 9 million rubles. For a frontline supporter looking at soldiers struggling to obtain basic equipment, that figure became symbolic. The argument was simple. How can senior officials spend millions on a luxury celebration while soldiers at the front are asking for equipment? This is where dissatisfaction starts moving beyond ideology. It becomes a question of fairness. And once people begin asking why those at the top are living differently from those paying the price, loyalty becomes much more fragile. The propaganda camp is developing cracks. Another remarkable example is Dmitry Borisenko. For years, he operated inside the pro-Kremlin media ecosystem. He supported the annexation of Crimea and worked with strongly anti-Maidan publications. But in July, he went much further than criticizing individual policies. He argued that Putin should resign. He described the invasion as a catastrophic mistake and said the country's political leadership, including the State Duma, should leave as well. That is an extraordinary statement inside today's Russia. And there is a reason such statements remain rare. The consequences can be severe. Consider the case of Ilya Remeslo. A Kremlin-linked lawyer who had previously built a reputation attacking Putin's opponents eventually published a manifesto explaining why he had stopped supporting the president. Soon afterward, reports indicated that he had been placed in a psychiatric institution in St. Petersburg. Whether one views these cases as isolated or symbolic, the message is unmistakable. Criticizing the system from inside the system can carry enormous personal risks. Yet people continue to speak. And that raises an even bigger question. What happens when dissatisfaction reaches the wealthy elite? The billionaires are moving money. The most revealing signs of instability may not be found in speeches at all. They may be hidden in bank transfers. Reports have indicated that some of Russia's wealthiest businessmen have been moving significant amounts of money out of the country. The destinations reportedly include financial channels connected to cryptocurrency, gold, Dubai, and Gulf states. Why? Because the fear isn't necessarily coming from Western governments anymore. It is increasingly coming from Moscow itself. Over the past year, the Russian state has dramatically expanded its seizure of private assets. According to figures cited by Russia's prosecutor general, assets worth tens of billions of dollars were transferred to state control through court decisions. Major businessmen have lost companies and fortunes. Some have disappeared from Russia's billionaire rankings. And a proposal for wealthy Russians to make larger financial contributions to the state reportedly received Putin's approval. Put these developments together and a pattern begins to emerge. The population is becoming angry. The wealthy are becoming cautious. And the state is becoming more demanding. Different groups. Different motivations. But the same underlying emotion. Uncertainty about where Russia is heading. The fuel crisis may be the real test. Now we reach the issue that could affect almost everyone. Fuel. Ukraine's drone campaign against Russian energy infrastructure has increasingly focused on oil refineries. Estimates vary dramatically. Ukrainian officials have claimed that more than 40% of refining capacity has been affected. The International Energy Agency has produced a much more conservative estimate, but still places the disruption at a significant level. Satellite analysis and other reporting have pointed to historically low refining activity. Dozens of major facilities have reportedly been targeted. And when refineries stop working, the consequences don't remain inside the refinery. They travel. To petrol stations. To trucks. To farms. To supermarkets. To factories. And eventually into household budgets. That is exactly what appears to be happening. Fuel restrictions have reportedly spread across dozens of Russian regions. Some stations have limited how much customers can purchase. Others have introduced waiting periods between purchases. In certain areas, enormous queues have appeared. And reports from Siberia have even described teachers being brought in alongside police to help manage disputes at petrol stations. Imagine what that says about the problem. This is no longer simply an energy sector inconvenience. It is becoming a public order problem. The irony of Russia's oil heartland. Perhaps the most striking part is where some of these shortages are occurring. Russia is one of the world's largest energy producers. Yet even areas sitting on enormous oil reserves have experienced fuel shortages. One resident described the contradiction perfectly. Russia has oil. Russia has wells. But there is nowhere to put some of the crude. And yet people cannot find fuel at the pump. That is the difference between producing a resource and successfully processing and distributing it. And when refinery capacity is damaged, having oil underground doesn't solve the immediate problem. The consequences can even reach the black market. Reports have described diesel being sold on highways for dramatically inflated prices. The central bank has also acknowledged that fuel shortages can push prices higher across the economy. And that brings us to the second major problem. Inflation. The Russia on paper versus the Russia people experience. Official statistics can tell one story. Households can tell another. The Kremlin's economic narrative emphasizes stability. But surveys cited in the script suggest Russians themselves feel that prices have risen far more sharply than official inflation figures indicate. For lower-income households, the perception is even worse. And everyday life provides the explanation. Taxes have increased. Utility bills have risen sharply. Food prices are climbing. Families are changing when they shop simply to find discounted products. In Moscow's supermarkets, shoppers have reportedly been timing their purchases around evening markdowns on meat and dairy products. Meanwhile, the wage picture is also uneven. Official statistics may show strong nationwide wage growth. But some public sector employees outside Moscow reportedly describe much lower incomes and even salary reductions. That produces a dangerous psychological gap. The government says the economy is growing. The statistics say wages are increasing. But a worker standing in a supermarket sees, my money buys less than it used to. And when those three realities collide, trust begins to erode. Then comes the farm. The fuel problem becomes even more serious when it reaches agriculture. A farmer can survive a bad news cycle. He cannot survive a harvest that never gets collected. The logic is brutally simple. No diesel means fewer machines operating. Fewer machines mean crops remain in the fields. Missed harvest windows mean grain can be lost. Less grain means higher pressure on animal feed. And that eventually affects meat and dairy production. One Russian farmer summarized the chain. No fuel. No harvest. No grain. No feed. No meat or milk. That isn't political theory. It is basic agricultural economics. And timing makes the problem worse. Once grain reaches maturity, farmers have a narrow window to harvest it. Wait too long and the crop can fall. Rain can make fields impossible for heavy machinery. A modern combine harvester can consume hundreds of liters of diesel during a working shift. But if petrol stations are limiting purchases to quantities below what a machine needs for a full day, farmers face an impossible calculation. Some have reportedly spent nights waiting at stations for fuel deliveries. And regions heavily dependent on agriculture are beginning to discuss potentially significant losses. Moscow gets priority. Then comes the political question. When fuel becomes scarce, who gets it first? According to the reporting cited here, authorities have prioritized Moscow and St. Petersburg. That makes economic sense from the perspective of protecting the country's political and administrative centers. But politically, it can be explosive. Because someone in a rural region may look at the situation and conclude, we are producing the resources, but Moscow is getting the resources. That resentment is already being described by some economists as a growing divide between the center and the regions. And history shows why that matters. When regional populations begin believing that the capital consumes resources while peripheral areas absorb the costs, economic frustration can become political frustration. So why hasn't Putin fallen? This is where the story needs some honesty. Everything we have discussed does not mean that Putin is about to lose power. Russia's political system remains extraordinarily resilient. Public support for the war remains substantial in many polls. Putin's approval rating, despite economic pressures, remains high compared with the leaders of many Western democracies. And most importantly, the state still controls a powerful security apparatus. Russia has harsh laws against statements deemed to discredit the military. Thousands of people have reportedly been detained over anti-war activity. The cost of open dissent remains extremely high. That alone can suppress visible opposition even when private dissatisfaction is growing. But there is another factor that is even more important. Many of the angry people we have discussed are not anti-war. That changes everything. This isn't necessarily a peace revolt. Glemon's criticism illustrates the contradiction. He isn't necessarily demanding that Russia abandon the war. Some loyalists want the opposite. They want the military to fight more effectively. They want stronger attacks. They want better equipment. They want competent leadership. In other words, their anger isn't "Stop the war." It is "Why are you failing to win the war?" That is a fundamentally different political force. Historically, authoritarian systems can survive opposition from people who never had influence inside the establishment. What can become dangerous is when members of the establishment themselves conclude that the leadership is incompetent. Because those people already understand how the system works. They know the language. They know the institutions. They know where the weaknesses are. And they can turn from supporters into critics without ever becoming traditional liberals or peace activists. The most dangerous word, failure. That is why the criticism from military analysts may matter more than criticism from opposition politicians. When a regime's opponents say the leadership is failing, the government can dismiss them. When former loyalists say it, the message becomes harder to contain. A military analyst questioning the country's capabilities. A propagandist questioning the president. A businessman moving assets abroad. A farmer complaining about fuel. A worker complaining about wages. A driver spending hours at a petrol station. Each event is small. Together, they create something larger. A widening distance between the Russia presented by state television and the Russia experienced by ordinary citizens. That distance is the real threat. But there is another possibility: apathy. Not every dissatisfied Russian becomes an opponent. Some simply stop caring. Polling cited in the script suggests that a significant portion of Russians are increasingly disengaged from war-related news. That is important. Because anger can create political movements. But apathy can stabilize authoritarian systems. If people believe nothing can change, they may simply adapt. They pay the higher price. They wait in the fuel queue. They buy the discounted groceries. They avoid political discussions. And they move on. That may be precisely the environment in which the Kremlin feels most comfortable. The question that remains. So where does all of this lead? Perhaps nowhere. Russia may absorb the pressure. The government may find new sources of fuel. Refineries may return to operation. The state may increase repression. Propagandists may be replaced. And public frustration may gradually disappear. But there is another possibility. The anger inside Russia could continue moving upward. First it reaches the bloggers. Then the military analysts. Then businessmen. Then officials. And eventually, perhaps, someone much closer to the center of power begins asking the question that authoritarian leaders fear most. Is the problem the war itself, or the people running it? That is the dividing line to watch. Because Putin's greatest danger may not be a Russian who never supported him. It may be a Russian who supported him for years, believed the promises, defended the war, and eventually concluded that the leadership had failed. A regime can survive criticism from its enemies. It becomes much harder to survive when its own supporters stop believing its story. And right now, the most important battle for the Kremlin may not be taking place on a battlefield at all. It may be taking place in petrol queues, supermarket aisles, farm fields, corporate offices, military circles, and inside the minds of the people who once believed Putin could deliver victory. The question isn't whether Russia is collapsing tomorrow. There is no evidence to make that prediction. The question is whether these separate frustrations can eventually connect. Because if they do, the Kremlin may discover that the hardest problem to suppress isn't opposition. It's disillusionment from within.